Say that, I agree at first. And I don't have a problem either with accounts that post like super cringy examples of liberal insanity. I think that stuff could be funny too, the real over the top kind of social justice warrior stuff. Like, obviously that is ridiculous, and a lot of times it does cross a line, and I think just optically a lot of times it's pretty bad for the left because it puts people off, especially just normal working class people that are concerned with more kind of bread and butter issues and aren't mired in this culture war muck. So I think there's a lot of accuracy to that, Glenn. But I also think it's fair to say that when you were more on board with them, and now you've voiced these criticisms and have made it obvious where you disagree. But a lot of people would say it was kind of obvious that was the real nature of this account from the beginning, or at least for a while, including while you were still promoting them. And that kind of gets back to this accusation, which of course you've pushed back on multiple times, which is that you are becoming like a right-wing media influencer or a useful idiot for the right wing. And while I'm not saying that that's what I believe, wouldn't that kind of be an example of proving that assertion in the sense that, you were defending this, oh, it's all good, until all of a sudden it's not. But a lot of people were like, yeah, but that was obvious from the beginning. And they were clearly using these coded transphobic and homophobic arguments in order to, make this, and in a sense, even potentially using you as a member of the LGBT community yourself to cover for them.
So let me say a couple things. First of all, my vocal dissent from and opposition to left-wing kind of woke tactics, and by left-wing I just mean there's a lot of neoliberals, a lot of liberals in the Democratic Party who are very like centrist or establishment on foreign policy and economic policy, have kind of joined hands with the cultural left to weaponize and deploy a lot of these themes about white supremacy and misogyny and transphobia. I don't think there's a big gap between, like kind of like Nancy Pelosi, Hillary Clinton, Chuck Schumer, liberals, and the mainstream, say, Bernie AOC left on these cultural issues. So when I say the left, I just kind of mean where the left and the liberals converge on these cultural issues. The first time I really started speaking out about these was in 2015 and 2016, when these issues were weaponized by the Hillary Clinton campaign against Bernie Sanders supporters to claim that Bernie Sanders was relying upon a uniquely misogynistic and particularly kind of abusive and toxic online militancy that reflected very poorly on the campaign. And right from the beginning, it was obvious to me that this was going to be the new tactic of the establishment, was to weaponize these kind of issues about racism and misogyny and transphobia to insulate themselves from legitimate critique. And they not only deployed it against Bernie Sanders, but they did so even more aggressively and dishonestly and cynically against Jeremy Corbyn. It's basically how they destroyed Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, was by not only pinning that label on him that he had a misogynistic online following, but also that he and his followers were anti-Semitic. I mean, that became the number one way of demonizing him. And so I am very wary of this part of the liberal left that so casually and frequently throws around these accusations. And I will say actually that even earlier, the way that I would vocally criticize this tactic was when Israel defenders did it years ago and still do it. That any critics of Israel were anti-Semitic. This is where it comes from. This formula that if you disagree with me, you're going to stand publicly accused of the worst kinds of bigotry is something that I think the worst political factions have been engaging in.
Agreed.
So this suspicion that I have of this kind of cultural leftism and the way it interplays in politics is a long-standing one of mine. Mm-hmm. And I just want to get your guys' understanding of this, because this is, I guess, where what it always comes down to for me is the way this whole issue about trans equality emerged was, and you can trace this with data and people have, is that in 2015 with Obergefell and the Supreme Court ruling that it's unconstitutional to deny same-sex couples marriage equality, every last item on what had always been for decades the gay and lesbian cause was essentially won. And so instead of I'm not saying there weren't lingering, prejudices towards gay men and lesbian. Of course there were, but really Obergefell ratified what had been the success in public opinion.
Yeah.
Majorities, including young conservatives, thought, of course, gay couples should be able to have marriage equality. So it was won. And instead of kind of closing up shop and saying, time to go home, we won, there was this sudden emphasis on trans issues where it had never been there before. And even there, the reason I never talked much about it was because it was such an easy issue to me. Like, the idea that adults have the right to find whatever brings them the greatest self-actualization, and that society's job is to never impede that and always enable it, is so foundational to all of my views. I mean, that's the foundational ideology that led to the victory of gay and lesbian ideology. And so to me, it was so obvious. Of course, that's the same for trans issues. Mm-hmm. What ended up happening is that the agenda went way beyond that. And I don't know, do you guys think it's valid to ask how old someone, like a child, has to be before they are recognized as trans or given access to like hormonal treatments or surgeries, or should they be able to compete in sports, or should they be taught these things in school? Like, these issues, I think, are debatable.
Right. Well, a couple of responses to that. First of all, sorry, what was I going to say? First of all, I don't think it's transphobic to have those conversations. Whether it's the sports one or what age is it acceptable to start a transition. I don't think it's transphobic to have that discussion. But frankly, I see the right wing having that discussion and obsessing over those discussions a lot more, frankly, than the left wing, which just seems, at least from my perspective, to be more approaching it with a live and let live perspective. Leave it up to the families. The right wing pretends to care a lot about, family choice and letting the parents decide what's best for their kids and all that. And I think largely that's the position that's been adopted by the left when it comes to the trans issue as it relates to kids. This should be something that's left up to families. They're the ones that know their kids best and have that, perspective and experience. They should be the ones to decide that. It shouldn't be the state stepping in. It shouldn't be the government stepping in to regulate that or make those decisions for people, for transgender individuals. So that's what I would say, first of all, is that I see way more obsession over this from the right rather than the left. And second off, I would ask, what exactly do you mean by the trans agenda? Because I think, for me at least, and I'm sure other people listening, that kind of sounds like what a lot of Christian, straight, or evangelicals said about the gay agenda. We're okay with gay people, but why are they now asking for all of these rights and acceptance? Why are they shoving their gayness in our face and doing their pride parades? This is the gay agenda. In the same way, I feel like there's a lot of fear mongering and moral panic that's been whipped up around relatively just private people's lives, innocuous sort of private decisions. Like I said, whether or not someone wants to transition is their own business. It doesn't affect me. It doesn't affect you. And again, when it comes to something like sports, I'm not an athlete, so I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, if you've gone through puberty as a man, then you're no different than a woman. I don't think that's necessarily true. And I think that people that are in the athletic field and that are physical scientists and all that crap can have that discussion and decide what's most fair for everyone. But again, I would say that it seems, to me at least, like the right wing is the side that's far more fixated on these issues, ginning up this panic and this fear about them. And often, from what I observe at least, the left is just simply, responding. They're just defending because these, often very transphobic arguments are being put out there and put into the mainstream discourse. And people like me and Zach, we're like, we have to defend, these people. They're people just like me and you, and I defend their right to do what they want in their private life.
So, look, I mean, let me just say, I turned 13 in 1980, which was probably the single worst decade in the last 100 years to kind of come of age as a gay teenager, because at least for the few decades prior to that, it was kind of treated with silence, which wasn't good at all. But in the 80s, it became this very aggressively anti-gay ethos. It was the rise of the Reagan Republicans and the social conservatives he brought with him, driven by the moral majority of Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell. And they brought this kind of like aggressive anti-gay rhetoric into the discourse. But far worse than that, to grow up gay in the United States or anywhere really in the West meant that you were inculcated with the idea that who you were and who you are is spiritually and emotionally and psychologically sick. which is a incredibly horrible burden to have to endure when you're 12 and 13 and 14, and for the rest of your life that shapes and affects you. But in the 80s, it became that you're not just spiritually and emotionally and psychologically sick, you were actually physically sick, because the only representations of gay life in media that you saw were, images of people covered with sores, dying of this hideous disease that no one understood. Nurses were afraid to go into their rooms. You heard all kinds of terrible stories about gay people whose partners had no legal standing and they were barred by their families from being with them while they were dying. It was, as awful as it could get to have to ingest and internalize. So I know from the most vivid and visceral experience what it's like when society is trying to tell you that you are dangerous and sick and bad in terms of who you are, which is why I say that for me, there's no debate, none. I do think it's transphobic even to question. As Matt Walsh recently did, he said, I think it should be illegal for any trans-affirming surgeries to be permitted, which, is to place the state in between doctors and adults and to tell adults that Matt Walsh knows better for them what they in their own lives need and should have to be treated for a medical condition, gender dysphoria. All this stuff is, so obvious and basic to me that I barely think it's worth debating. What I think is very disingenuous is the framing that you affirmed, which is the idea that, look, there's no agenda here, there's no ideological movement, there's no attempt to radically transform society. This is just individual adults trying to live their own lives in peace, and the right is obsessed with them and constantly wanting to focus on and invade their private lives. This just isn't true, Gavin. It's just not an accurate description. When in the 80s and the 90s, I really started doing gay activism in the 90s, we knew that we were agitating for radical changes in the society. We wanted to redefine what marriage meant in a way that was different than it had been understood for centuries, if not millennia before that. We knew we were demanding that people radically change their views of homosexuality that was taught to them for centuries or more in the Bible and in their religion, and to try and view gay people in a radically different way. So to deny that we had an agenda, a political agenda, or that we were calling on society to radically reorganize itself legally and culturally and socially was, would have been preposterous. Of course we were doing that. And of course the trans movement is doing that as well. That's what the movement is. They're saying,